I didn't raise my voice when Karen stormed into the county planning office demanding to know why there was suddenly a concrete barrier blocking what she called her shortcut. I just sat there quietly while she screamed at the clerk about property rights and easements, watching her face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally, that particular shade of panic that comes when someone realizes they've made a very expensive mistake. When she finally noticed me sitting in the corner with a stack of freshly signed ownership documents, I simply smiled and said, "You should have asked before you tore down my fence," the way her lawyer went. Completely silent when I showed him the purchase receipt. For the entire disputed boundary strip was worth every penny of the 6 months I'd spent planning this moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 6 months earlier, I wasn't thinking about legal warfare or property acquisitions. I was just a guy who wanted to fix up the little house I'd inherited from my aunt, and maybe enjoy some peace and quiet for the first time in years. The place wasn't much to look at when I first got the keys, a modest 2-bedroom ranch on about 1.5 acres, tucked into what used to be farmland before the developers carved it up into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision. My aunt had lived there for 30 years, back when it was still considered out in the country and your nearest neighbor was a 1/4 mile away through the trees. She'd been the original holdout when the land around her got developed in the early 2000s. Refusing every buyout offer and watching as they built fancy houses with 3-car garages and perfectly manicured lawns on lots that used to grow corn, the house itself needed work, but it had character. Original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, a kitchen window that looked out over a little pond my aunt had dug herself, and a wraparound porch where you could sit with your morning coffee and actually hear birds instead of traffic. After 15 years of living in apartments and condos, moving from city to city for work, I was ready for something that felt permanent, something that was mine. I'd saved up enough to take a year off between jobs, and my plan was simple: spend the spring and summer fixing up the house. Maybe put in a garden, learn how to be still for a while. My aunt had always said the place was meant for someone who needed to slow down and remember what mattered. After the divorce and the job burnout, and generally feeling like I'd been running on empty for longer than I cared to admit, that someone was definitely me. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I started with the basics: new roof, updated electrical, fixing the plumbing that my aunt had been nursing, along with duct tape and prayers. I hired local contractors who knew the house and didn't try to talk me into replacing everything with modern upgrades. During the day, I'd work alongside them, learning skills I'd never had time to develop. In the evenings, I'd sit on that porch with a beer and actually feel my shoulders relax for the first time in years. The neighbors were polite but kept their distance, which suited me fine. I wasn't looking to join the social scene or get involved in whatever drama might be percolating in suburbia. I just wanted to sand floors and plant tomatoes and remember what it felt like to live somewhere. That felt like home. The boundary between my property and the subdivision was marked by an old rail fence that my aunt had maintained for decades. Nothing fancy, just weathered wood posts and rails that followed the natural curve of the land, with wild honeysuckle growing through the gaps and a gate at the back where the original farm road used to connect to what was now Meadowbrook Drive. I'd walked that fence line dozens of times during those first weeks, checking for damage and planning where I might need to replace posts or rails. The property survey I'd inherited with the house showed exactly where the line ran. My aunt had been meticulous about maintaining it right up to the legal boundary. She'd told me once that good fences make good neighbors, and that she'd learned early on to be very clear about where her land ended and other people's began. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the sound of splintering wood. At first, I thought maybe a tree had fallen in the storm we'd had the night before. But when I looked out the window, I saw something that made my coffee cup stop halfway to my lips. There was a bright yellow Hummer parked sideways across my fence line, and a woman in workout clothes was using a crowbar to tear down an entire section of rails. She worked with the focused determination of someone who'd done this before, stacking the broken wood in a pile and then dragging it out of the way. When she was satisfied with the size of the gap, she got back in the Hummer and drove straight through my property. cutting across the corner of my yard to connect with the main road on the other side. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't accidental damage or a misunderstanding about property lines. This was deliberate destruction of my fence to create some kind of shortcut. I grabbed my jacket and walked out to survey the damage, half expecting to find some kind of note or explanation. Maybe an emergency that had justified the destruction. But there was nothing except tire tracks gouged deep into my lawn and about 30 feet of fence rails reduced to kindling. The gate that had been there for decades was completely gone, hardware and all. Someone had just decided that my property was their personal highway. That afternoon, I drove to the subdivision's entrance and found the HOA office tucked into a converted house near the main gate. The receptionist was pleasant enough when I explained that someone had destroyed my fence, but her tone changed completely when I mentioned the address. "Oh," she said, suddenly very busy with paperwork, "that's not actually in our jurisdiction. Your property is grandfathered in from before the subdivision was developed." When I asked if she knew anything about residents using my land as a shortcut, she got even more evasive. "You'd have to take that up with individual homeowners," she said. "We can't control what people do on private property. That's not part of the association." I tried the direct approach first. I spent the next few days watching for the yellow Hummer, finally caught it cutting through my property again on Thursday evening. I flagged down the driver, a woman in her 40s with the kind of aggressive blonde highlights that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When I politely explained that she was driving across my private property and had damaged my fence, she looked at me like I'd just asked her to explain quantum physics. "This has always been a shortcut," she said, as if that settled the matter. "Everyone uses it to get to the yoga studio. It saves like 10 minutes off the drive." When I pointed out that it's still my property and she'd destroyed my fence without permission, she rolled her eyes. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but this is how we've always done it. If you've got an issue, take it up with the HOA. Her name." I learned from the registration visible on her dashboard was Karen Morrison, and she lived at 1247 Meadowbrook Drive, one of the largest houses in the subdivision. With a circular driveway and enough lawn to host a small golf tournament, over the next week, I documented every vehicle that used my property as a shortcut. Karen's yellow Hummer was the most frequent offender, but she wasn't alone. I counted at least 6 different cars and SUVs that had decided my yard was their personal bypass route. They'd worn a path through the grass that was starting to look like an actual road. And every day the tire tracks got deeper and the damage spread wider. I decided to try the diplomatic route. I drafted a polite letter explaining that the land was private property, that the fence had been destroyed without permission, and that I was asking everyone to please use the official subdivision roads instead of cutting through my yard. I made copies and personally delivered one to every house that I'd seen using the shortcut, including Karen's palatial place on Meadowbrook Drive. Most people didn't answer their doors, but the few who did gave me variations of the same response. "We've always used that route," or "It's not hurting anything," or "Take it up with the HOA if you have a problem." Karen's response was more direct. She called me that evening. Her tone made it clear that she considered my request somewhere between unreasonable and personally offensive. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, "but that shortcut has been there for years. My kids use it to get to school. I use it to get to my appointments. And half the neighborhood depends on it for accessing the main road. Just because you inherited some old house doesn't mean you get to disrupt everyone's routine." When I mentioned that I was planning to rebuild the fence, she laughed. "Good luck with that. The HOA will never approve a fence that blocks established traffic patterns. You'd better check the covenants before you waste your money." That comment about covenants was interesting, because my property wasn't subject to any HOA agreements. My aunt had been careful about that when the subdivision was developed, making sure her land remained independent. But Karen's confidence suggested she either didn't know that or didn't care. I started to suspect that this wasn't just about convenience, this was about control. Karen had gotten used to treating my property like her personal domain, and my appearance as the new owner was threatening that arrangement. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you do stupid things, but the cold, calculating kind that makes you very dangerous. I stopped making phone calls and started making plans. The first step was to understand exactly what I was dealing with, legally speaking. I drove to the county courthouse and pulled every document related to my property, the original deed, survey records, tax assessments, and anything else that might be relevant. What I found was fascinating. My aunt's property had indeed been carved out when the subdivision was developed. But the way the boundaries were drawn created an interesting situation. The most direct route from the subdivision to the main road actually required crossing a narrow strip of my land, which explained why residents had started treating it like a public thoroughfare. But there was absolutely nothing in any legal document that granted them that right. More interesting was what I found in the subdivision's original development plans. The builders had apparently intended to purchase that strip of land from my aunt to create a proper access road, but she'd refused to sell. Instead of redesigning their layout, they'd simply built the subdivision as if the access would be available eventually, leaving residents with no choice but to use either the main entrance on the far side of the development or cut across my property. For 20 years, that arrangement had worked because my aunt was elderly and rarely used her backyard. But now, there was a new owner who actually cared about trespassing and property damage. The more I dug into county records, the more I realized that Karen and her neighbors had made a critical assumption: that established usage patterns somehow trumped actual property ownership. In some cases, that might be truth. There are laws about easements and prescriptive rights that can give people legal access to land they've been using for years. But those laws have very specific requirements about how the usage has to be open, obvious, and continuous. More importantly, they don't apply when the usage is happening without the property owner's knowledge or consent. My aunt had been aware of the trespassing, but had been too old and tired to fight it. That wasn't the same as granting permission. I spent 3 weeks researching property law, easement rights, and HOA authority. What I learned was that Karen had been operating under a completely false assumption about her legal standing. Not only did residents have no right to use my property as a shortcut, but the HOA had absolutely no authority to prevent me from controlling access to my own land. The covenants and restrictions that governed the subdivision simply didn't apply to property that had never been part of the development. I could build any fence I wanted, block any access I chose. There wasn't a thing the HOA could do to stop me. But knowledge and action are different things. I could have simply rebuilt my fence and posted no trespassing signs, and probably would have won any legal challenge that followed. But that felt too simple, too easy. Karen had been dismissive and entitled, treating my property like her personal convenience and my concerns like an inconvenience to be brushed aside. Her neighbors had been complicit, using my land without permission and then acting like I was the problem when I asked them to stop. They all seemed to believe that their convenience trumped my property rights, and that I should just accept the damage and disruption because that's how they'd always done things. That's when I started thinking about the nuclear option. If the problem was that residents needed to cross my land to access the main road efficiently, then the solution wasn't to block that access, it was to control it. And the best way to control access to land is to own the land that controls the access. I started researching what other property was available in the area and discovered something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. The county was getting ready to auction off several small parcels of unused land that had been acquired for a road expansion project that never happened. One of those parcels was a narrow strip that ran along the back boundary of the subdivision. Connecting my property to the main road, the strip was only about 50 feet wide and maybe half a mile long. Basically useless for development, but perfect for controlling access. According to the auction listing, the county expected it to sell for just enough to cover administrative costs. Since there was no obvious commercial use for such an oddly shaped piece of land, but I could see a very specific use for it, turning Karen's convenient shortcut into my private driveway. If I owned that connecting strip, I could legally control exactly who was allowed to use it and under what circumstances. I could charge tolls, restrict hours, require permits, or simply decide that certain people weren't welcome at all. The county auction was scheduled for the second Tuesday in June, and I spent the month beforehand preparing. I had the land surveyed to confirm the boundaries, researched comparable sales to estimate the bidding range, and lined up financing in case the price went higher than expected. Most importantly, I kept my mouth shut about my intentions. As far as Karen and her neighbors knew, I was just the new guy who was annoyed about his fence and would probably give up and go away eventually. They had no idea that I was planning to acquire monopoly control over their favorite transportation route. The auction itself was almost anticlimactic. There were only 3 bidders: me, a local farmer who wanted to expand his pasture, and a developer who pulled out early when he realized the land was too narrow for anything profitable. The farmer dropped out at $8,000, leaving me as the sole bidder at $8,500. For less than $10,000, I had purchased the power to completely control access between Meadowbrook Estates and the main road. The closing was scheduled for the following week, and I spent those few days planning exactly how I wanted to handle the reveal. I decided to start with a fence. Not the rail fence that Karen had destroyed, but something more substantial. I hired a contractor to install a 6-foot privacy fence along the entire boundary between my original property and the subdivision. With a single gate at the point where residents had been cutting through, the gate was secured with a heavy-duty lock and a sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing, access by permission." Only, I had security cameras installed to monitor the gate and record any attempts to damage or bypass the fence. By the end of the week, the shortcut that Karen and her neighbors had been using for years was completely blocked. The reaction was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. My phone started ringing within hours of the fence installation, with angry residents demanding to know what gave me the right to block their access road. Karen was the most vocal, calling me 3 times in one afternoon to explain that I was being unreasonable and that the HOA would never stand for this kind of disruption. "You can't just block off a road that everyone has been using for decades," she said. "This is going to add 20 minutes to everyone's commute. Do you have any idea how inconvenient this is?" I listened patiently to each complaint. My response was always the same. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, but this is private property, and I don't give permission for it to be used as a public road. You're welcome to use the main entrance to the subdivision like everyone else." When people mentioned easements or established usage patterns, I politely explained that those didn't apply to my situation. When they threatened legal action, I encouraged them to consult with their attorneys. When Karen mentioned the HOA, I reminded her that my property wasn't subject to their authority. What they didn't know, and what I didn't tell them, was that blocking the shortcut through my original property was just the first step. The real power play was about to begin. A week after the fence went up, I got a call from a woman who identified herself as the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Her name was Patricia Williams, and her tone was professional but firm. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "we need to discuss this fence situation. The board has received numerous complaints from residents about blocked access, and we believe there may be some misunderstanding about the property boundaries and usage rights." I agreed to meet with her, curious to see how the HOA planned to handle the situation. We met at a coffee shop halfway between my house and the subdivision, and Patricia arrived with a folder full of documents and the confident air of someone who was used to getting her way. She was probably in her 60s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of polished authority that comes from years of running meetings and managing conflicts. "Let me start by saying that we understand your position," she began. "You're the new property owner, and you want to establish clear boundaries. That's completely reasonable. But we also have a responsibility to our residents. And this access issue is creating significant problems for the entire community." She spread out a map of the area and pointed to the various routes residents could take to reach the main road. "As you can see, blocking this access point forces everyone to drive all the way around the subdivision, adding considerable time and distance to routine trips. For families with children, elderly residents, and people who rely on this route for work commutes, this is more than just an inconvenience, it's a real hardship." She paused and looked at me seriously. "We're prepared to discuss compensation for granting an easement across your property. The board has authorized me to offer $5,000 for a permanent right-of-way agreement." I listened to her presentation, studied her maps, and nodded thoughtfully at her offer. "I appreciate your position," I said, "and I understand the inconvenience this is causing your residents. But I'm afraid I'm not interested in granting an easement across my property. The damage to my land has been significant, and I've had no cooperation from residents about respecting property boundaries or controlling their usage. I don't think a formal easement agreement would solve those underlying problems. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike. Mr. Thompson, I think you may be underestimating the legal complexity of this situation. Some of our residents have been using this route for more than 20 years, which may have created prescriptive rights that supersede your property ownership. The board would prefer to resolve this amicably, but we're prepared to pursue legal remedies if necessary. She pulled out another document and slid it across the table. This is a letter from our attorney outlining the potential easement claims that could be made. I think you'll find it educational. I read through the letter, which was full of legal terminology about adverse possession, prescriptive easements, and established usage patterns. It was clearly designed to intimidate me into accepting the HOA's easement offer. But it also revealed something important. They had no idea about my recent land purchase. The attorney's analysis was based entirely on the assumption that residents needed to cross my original property to reach the main road. They didn't know that I now controlled an alternative route that would make their legal threats completely meaningless. This is very interesting, I said, handing the letter back. Your attorney has clearly done his research, but I think there might be some aspects of the situation that he hasn't considered. Would it be possible for me to address the entire HOA board about this issue? I think I might have some information that would be relevant to your decision-making process. Patricia looked surprised but agreed to schedule a meeting. The board meets every third Thursday of the month, she said. I can add this to the agenda for next week if you're available. She gathered her documents and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. Mr. Thompson, I hope you'll consider our offer seriously. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. It would be much better for all parties if we could reach an amicable resolution. I spent the week before the board meeting preparing my presentation. I had the county surveyor prepare detailed maps showing both my original property and the newly acquired access strip. I obtained copies of all the auction documents, the deed to the new land, and legal opinions about property rights and easement law. Most importantly, I had my attorney draft a proposal for what I was calling the Meadowbrook Access Agreement, a comprehensive plan for managing traffic through the newly acquired corridor. The board meeting was held in the community center of the subdivision, and it was packed. Word had apparently gotten around that the fence guy was going to make some kind of presentation, and it seemed like half the subdivision had shown up to hear what I had to say. I recognized several faces from my documentation of the shortcut users, including Karen, who was sitting in the front row with her arms crossed and an expression that could have melted steel. Patricia called the meeting to order and introduced me as a neighboring property owner with concerns about access issues. The polite applause was decidedly lukewarm. I stood up, connected my laptop to the projector, began with a simple statement. Thank you for the opportunity to address the board. I think there have been some misunderstandings about the property access situation, and I'd like to clear those up tonight. The first slide was a map showing the subdivision and my original property, with the disputed shortcut clearly marked. As you all know, residents have been using this route to access the main road for many years. My property has sustained significant damage from this traffic, and I recently installed a fence to prevent further unauthorized use. I could see heads nodding in the audience. This was the story. They all knew. The second slide showed the county auction results and a map of my newly acquired property. What you may not know is that 3 weeks ago, I purchased this adjacent parcel from the county. This land provides direct access from the subdivision to the main road without crossing my original property. The room went completely silent as people processed what they were seeing. I could see Patricia's eyes widen as she realized the implications. Now I continued. This creates an interesting opportunity. Instead of fighting about easements across my residential property, we can discuss a more appropriate solution. I'm prepared to allow subdivision residents to use this access route under a formal licensing agreement. I clicked to the next slide, which outlined the terms of my proposed agreement. The licensing fee would be $500 per household per year. Payable in advance? Usage would be limited to residents and their guests, with violations resulting in immediate termination of access privileges. I would maintain the road surface and provide basic security, but residents would be responsible for any damage they caused. Most importantly, the agreement could be terminated by either party with 90 days' notice. And access privileges were not transferable if homes were sold. Karen was the first person to speak when I finished my presentation. "This is ridiculous," she said, standing up and addressing the entire room. "He's trying to hold the whole neighborhood hostage over a stupid property dispute. Nobody should have to pay $500 a year just to drive to their own house." Her voice was getting louder and more shrill. "This is extortion, plain and simple. The board needs to fight this in court instead of giving in to his demands." But I could see that the board members were doing the math in their heads. $500 per household, times roughly 200 homes in the subdivision, and I was offering to provide access for about $100,000 per year. That was a significant revenue stream for maintaining what was essentially a private road. More importantly, they understood that I now had complete legal control over the situation. Their attorney's threats about prescriptive easements were meaningless when applied to land I'd just purchased at public auction. Patricia asked several practical questions about road maintenance, snow removal, and liability issues. The other board members wanted to know about the terms for guest access and whether the fees could be paid quarterly instead of annually. Karen kept interrupting to object to the entire concept, but it was clear that her support in the room was evaporating quickly. People were starting to realize that $500 a year was a lot cheaper than the legal fees they'd face trying to fight my ownership of the access route. The meeting ended, with the board agreeing to review my proposal and schedule a vote within 2 weeks. I packed up my materials and headed for the door, but Karen intercepted me in the parking lot. "You think you're really clever, don't you? Well, you picked the wrong neighborhood to mess with. I've lived here for 15 years. I'm not about to let some outsider come in and start charging tolls for using our own roads." I looked at her calmly and said, "Karen, it's not your road. It never was your road. It's my road now, legally purchased and properly recorded. You can pay the licensing fee like everyone else, or you can drive around the long way. Those are your options." I got in my car and started the engine. But she wasn't finished. "This isn't over," she yelled through my window. "The HOA will never approve this agreement. And when we take you to court, you're going to lose everything you put into this stupid scheme." I just smiled and drove away. But I could see her in my rearview mirror, standing in the parking lot with her fists clenched and her face red with fury. 2 weeks later, the board voted 4-1 to approve my access agreement. The only dissenting vote came from Karen's close friend on the board, who resigned in protest the following week. Within a month, I had signed agreements with over 90% of the households in the subdivision. The few holdouts discovered that driving all the way around to the main entrance really did add 20 minutes to every trip. And most of them eventually signed up as well. Karen held out longer than anyone else. For 3 months, she made the long drive every day. Her yellow Hummer, conspicuous in its absence from the access road that had once been her personal shortcut. But eventually, even she had to admit that the inconvenience was costing her more in time and gasoline than the licensing fee would cost in money. She signed her agreement on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I have to admit that I took particular satisfaction in processing that payment. The best part of the whole arrangement is how quiet my property has become. The access road runs along the back boundary of my land, far enough away that I can't hear the traffic from my house. My yard is green again where the tire tracks used to be. I never have to worry about unauthorized vehicles cutting through my garden or tearing down my fences. The $500 per household covers my costs for maintaining the road, provides a nice return on my investment, and creates a financial incentive for everyone to respect the rules. Most of the neighbors have accepted the new arrangement with good grace. They understand that they're paying for a valuable service, and many have commented that the access road is actually better. It's maintained now than it was when it was just an informal shortcut across my lawn. A few people even thanked me for finding a solution that worked for everyone instead of simply blocking access entirely. Karen still won't. make eye contact when she drives past my house. But she pays her fees on time and follows the rules about guest access. Every now and then, I see her at the local grocery store or gas station. She always finds a way to avoid being in the same aisle or standing in the same line. I think she's still angry about how everything turned out. But she's also learned an important lesson about assuming that other people's property is available for her personal convenience. The whole experience taught me something valuable about dealing with entitled behavior and property disputes. Sometimes the most effective response isn't to fight fire with fire, but to simply change the rules of the game entirely. Karen thought she was dealing with someone who would eventually give up and accept her trespassing. Instead, she found herself dealing with someone who had done his homework, understood his legal options, and was willing to invest time and money to solve the problem permanently. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evenings, I can hear birds again instead of car engines. The honeysuckle is growing back through my fence. My garden is thriving in soil that's no longer compacted by unauthorized traffic. Karen gets to keep using her shortcut, and I get paid for the privilege of letting her do it. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well in, charging fairly for the convenience.